Okay, our last video for this week is going to focus on the large intestines and what happens after the absorption in the small intestine, basically what's left. And so the remains of after absorption happens in the small intestine is moved along into the large intestine. It's about 500 milliliters of indigestible residue per day. And the large intestine is able to reduce that down to about 150 milliliters of feces by absorbing water and salts. So you can see there's lots of water absorption happening in the large intestines before we eliminate our feces by defecation. So take a look at the large intestine, just the gross anatomy. It is 1.5 meters long, 6.5 centimeters in diameter, and when we're looking at a cadaver. It starts at the cecum. The cecum is inferior to that ileocecal valve, which we talked about as the valve in between the small intestine and the large intestine. And at the lower end of the cecum, we see the appendix. And normally we think about the appendix as getting infected. It does have a dense population of lymphocytes and is a big source of immune cells. But it does get infected and can rupture, and that infection can then cause or move to other parts of the body when it ruptures. So taking a look at the large intestine, we are making our way through the large intestine. We go through the ascending colon, the right colic flexure, the transverse colon goes across the top, and then the left colic flexure is a turn, and then the descending colon. All of that frames the small intestine, literally like a picture frame. And then the sigmoid colon is the S-shaped portion that leads down into the pelvis. So here's a picture of all of that. And so you can see that the cecum is actually inferior to that ileocecal valve, and then the appendix down from there. And then the indigestible material travels up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, and then down the descending colon. And then we have that S-shaped part at the bottom called the sigmoid, and that is within the pelvis, or moving it into the pelvis, I should say. The rectum is the portion ending at the anal canal. There are 3 curves and infoldings, and we'll see those called rectal valves. And we'll see that when we see a close-up picture of that area. And then the anal canal is technically just the last final 3 centimeters of the large intestines. It passes through muscles, and the pelvic floor terminates at the anus. We see some mucus and lubricant that are released into the anal canal during defecation. And then we also are going to take a closer look and see where those hemorrhoidal veins are. There are hemorrhoidal veins in the anal columns, and so hemorrhoids is when those veins basically protrude into the anal canal and make bulges that can be external to the anus. I'm going to skip over this slide. This is talking about ways that the muscularis externa is unusual, different than the rest of the colon, or the rest of the digestive tract, I should say. But we're going to talk about these when we look at the picture coming up. And so here it is, and there's just some features that you need to know. So you need to know the rectal valve, and then those anal columns are those folds inside the anus and the rectum. Inside the rectum, I should say, not the anus. And then you see those veins in blue. Those are the hemorrhoidal veins that can bulge out. And then this shows the sphincter. So anytime you see the word sphincter, those are muscles that are contracting, kind of like a valve. Now, of course, this is kind of the side view or the cross-section view. So you know that those muscles are going to wrap all the way around. But there's 2. There's the internal anal sphincter and then the external as well. And those are contracting as defecation occurs. But as we see forward, we're going to see they're not both contracting at exactly the same time. This is talking about through the large intestine we see mucosa layer, which we've seen earlier in the digestive tract, and this here it is a simple columnar epithelium, and again this is where the water reabsorption is going to take place. But then in the anal canal it switches over to a non-keratinized stratified squamous, and that's to provide resistance to abrasion. And there's no circular folds or villi to increase surface area in the large intestines. So there's not necessary in the large intestine because we're not absorbing like we were in the small intestine. This is just reabsorption of water. This does have a greater density of mucus secreting goblet cells that we've seen earlier. And then the lamina propria and the submucosa layers have a lot of lymphatic tissue. This provides protection from the bacteria. There are lots of bacteria in the large intestine. 800 species. Oh my goodness, did you ever know it was that much? 800 species. We need that bacteria in our large intestine to digest the cellulose and other undigested carbohydrates. We can still be absorbing sugars at this point, but the cellulose doesn't get digested until this section of the digestive tract. This talks a little bit about gas. I'm sure that is intriguing to you, kind of where that gas is coming from and what is producing odor in the gas. So the large intestine takes about 12 to 24 hours to reduce the residue of a meal to feces. So it doesn't chemically change the residue, but again, reabsorbing water and electrolytes. And so what's left is our feces after it's gone all the way through this large intestine, and there's still some water in there, 75% water, 25% solids. And of that solids, 30% is bacteria, 30% is undigested fiber, and then 10 to 20% is fat. And then you kind of see the other mucus and epithelial cells that are in the feces in a small percentage. Okay, so we have contractions of the colon that kind of makes some segmentation every 30 minutes. And so it is the distension of the rostrum that stimulates those contractions. So that's why they're called rostral contractions. But as that is contracting every 30 minutes, we have mass movements, which is basically a time that you go number 2. That occurs 1 to 3 times a day. And so this has to do with some triggers from reflexes in the stomach and in the duodenum. So the filling of the stomach and the duodenum is what stimulates the movement of the colon. And each contraction moves the residue several centimeters. You should absolutely watch through that. And basically just talks about the stomach and the duodenum filling is what causes the colon contractions to begin. So the defecation reflexes have to do with stimulation from the stretching of the rectum. So when we kind of get an accumulation in the rectum, that's when we have these reflexes. So the urge to defecate is usually soon after a meal. And this talks about kind of the spinal cord. I'm really not picky about that. That's more reflexes than we need to know about at this point. And then it talks about that not only is it the internal and external sphincter, but the abdominal contractions increase pressure of the abdomen, and then it lifts the anal canal upward, and so then your feces just falls away. I think that is the funniest wording right there. I'm going to jump all the way past this and go to the end where it talked about kind of not disorders, but when there's oh gosh, I went too far. Hold on just a second. When too much water has been reabsorbed or not enough water has been reabsorbed. Bear with me here. Sorry about this. I'm not sure why Dr. Lynn had all of these in a weird order. Where do I want to be? Okay, right here. So we talked about water in the previous video, but we said that the large intestine is reabsorbing water. Well, if we have diarrhea, that happens when large intestine is absorbing not enough water, too little water. So that means lots of water is left over in the feces, and it passes through too quickly. Also, if the intestine is irritated, and then the feces have a high concentration of solute. One example would be lactose, which is a sugar. And then the opposite of that would be constipation. If the fecal movement is too slow, then too much water gets reabsorbed, and then the feces becomes hard and is difficult to defecate. And then this is just the other slides again. So that is all for this week.